Weddings are supposed to be about love, commitment, the kind of promises that last a lifetime. That's what people tell themselves, anyway. That's what I told myself as I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit, lifted my glass to join in yet another toast, and smiled at the right people at the right moments. And for the longest time, I believed in it. I believed in the idea of forever, in the strength of the vows my wife and I exchanged, in the weight of the rings we slipped onto each other's fingers. I believed we were different from the others, the ones who whispered behind closed doors, who hid their affairs in luxury hotel rooms, who stayed together for appearances while their real lives unfolded in secret. I thought we were better than that. I was wrong. The moment that shattered everything was so simple. Just a vibration against the white tablecloth, a single notification blinking on my phone screen. The kind of thing most people wouldn't even notice in the middle of a grand wedding celebration. But I did. I glanced down, absently at first, expecting something trivial, a work email, a friend checking in, maybe a message from someone in the room. Instead, I saw a name I hadn't thought about in years. Daniel Moreau. A man I barely knew. Someone from college, a distant acquaintance. Not close enough to be a friend, not distant enough to be a stranger. So why was he messaging me now? I unlocked my phone. I wasn't sure if I should send this. But if it were me, I'd want to know. A single sentence, followed by a video file. For a second, I hesitated. There was something about the wording, the weight of it, that unsettled me. That familiar, creeping instinct warning me that whatever waited on the other side of that play button wasn't something I could unsee. But I pressed it anyway. The video loaded slowly, buffering in the weak ballroom Wi-Fi. Then, the screen flickered to life. A dimly lit hallway. A woman in a champagne-colored dress. Her dress. I felt the first sharp crack in my chest. Not pain, not yet, just pressure. A strange, suffocating tightness that made my breath slow, my fingers tighten around my glass. I knew that dress better than anyone. I had watched her slip into it hours ago, fastening the delicate buttons at her back, smoothing out the fabric with practiced elegance. I had watched her twirl in front of the mirror, assessing herself, tilting her chin with quiet satisfaction as she admired the way it hugged her form. "Do I look like I belong here?" she had asked. The answer had been yes. She belonged in this world of luxury and grandeur, among the chandeliers and whispered power plays, the carefully curated social circles that dictated who mattered and who didn't. She had always wanted this life, and I had given it to her. But not like this. The footage continued. A man entered the frame. Tall, sharp suit, confident stride. He approached her with familiarity, his hand finding the small of her back. She didn't move away. She didn't hesitate. She leaned in first. My grip on the glass tightened. Their hands met in the dim light, a slow, practiced rhythm that spoke of something well-rehearsed. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was deliberate, intimate. The way she touched him, her fingers grazing his jaw, her nails dragging down his collar, was something I had seen before. Only now, it wasn't meant for me. I forced myself to watch the entire thing. Every movement. Every unspoken confession, the way she pulled him closer instead of pushing him away. The video ended. The screen went dark, and I found myself staring at my own reflection in the glass of my phone. A face that should have been filled with rage, with pain, with something anything other than this hollow, suffocating silence. But for a moment, there was nothing. No outburst. No reaction. Just the slow, creeping realization that my entire life had just been rewritten in the span of 40 seconds of grainy footage. The wedding celebration carried on around me. Laughter rang through the ballroom. A string quartet played something delicate and expensive. Waiters weaved between tables carrying crystal flutes filled with champagne. Conversations blended into one another, effortless and meaningless. And there she was, standing across the room, laughing, talking, completely at ease. The same way she had been before I pressed play. As if nothing had changed. As if she hadn't just ripped the ground out from under me. Our eyes met. A flicker of awareness passed through hers, so fleeting, so subtle that I might have imagined it. A recognition that something was off, that the man sitting at the table now wasn't the same man who had been sitting there minutes ago. But instead of alarm, she smiled. A soft, practiced curve of her lips. The same one she had given me countless times before. The pressure in my chest turned to something else. Something sharper. I placed my glass down with deliberate care, smoothed out the front of my jacket, adjusted the cuffs of my shirt. If she wanted to play pretend, I could play too. But not for long. Because the night wasn't over yet. And neither was this. The room felt colder now. Strange, considering the grand hall was filled with hundreds of guests, the air thick with warmth, perfume, and the faint scent of champagne. It was a place of celebration, of luxury, where people like us gathered to bask in our own perfection. I scanned the ballroom. The details stood out sharper now. The polished marble floor gleaming under golden chandeliers, the pristine white table linens untouched by a single misplaced crumb. Everything was curated to appear flawless. Just like us. The irony made my stomach turn. Somewhere, the bride and groom were lost in their own moment, oblivious to the fractures forming in someone else's marriage on the sidelines of their perfect day. I wondered, briefly, how long their happiness would last before reality caught up to them. Before they ended up like the rest of us, like me, sitting in a room full of people and realizing I was utterly, profoundly alone. My mind raced, unraveling details I hadn't noticed before. The way she had insisted we take separate cars to the venue. The text messages she had ignored throughout the night. The way she had disappeared for long stretches of time, always returning with some excuse, a smile that seemed just a little too composed. Had it been happening right under my nose? Had I been blind? Or just unwilling to see? I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingertips together. No, not tonight. Tonight, I wasn't going to drown in questions and self-doubt. I wasn't going to sit in silence and pretend to be the kind of man who let things like this go. She had made her choice. Now, I was going to make mine. I stood up from the table, my movements slow and deliberate. The ballroom stretched before me in a sea of shimmering gowns, polished shoes, and carefully curated conversations. Laughter rang out, crystal glasses clinked in quiet toasts, and somewhere in the distance, the band played a song that no one was truly listening to. It was all background noise. I walked through the crowd with measured steps, weaving between guests, nodding at the occasional familiar face. My body moved on autopilot, but my mind was sharp, calculating. I didn't let my gaze drift toward her just yet. She was still across the room, unaware that the ground beneath her feet had already begun to crack. As I passed the open bar, I caught a glimpse of myself in the long mirror mounted behind the shelves of expensive liquor. I looked the same as I had an hour ago, impeccably dressed, composed, unreadable. No one would have guessed that only minutes ago, I had watched the woman I married betray me in a shadowed corridor just beyond the glow of this perfect, high society gathering. My expression didn't change. It couldn't. Not yet. I picked up a drink from a passing waiter's tray, something dark in a heavy glass, and took a slow sip. The burn was steady, grounding. Then I turned toward her. She stood in the center of a small circle of guests, engaged in effortless conversation. Her posture was poised, her smile subtle but inviting. The men in the group were drawn to her presence, leaning in slightly as they spoke, as if unconsciously vying for her attention. The women, too, watched her carefully, measuring themselves against her, silently adjusting their own posture, their own tone, trying to match the quiet control she exuded. She thrived in this world. She had learned its rules, mastered them, and played them better than most. But tonight, she had miscalculated. I made my approach slow, giving her no warning, no time to compose a mask she hadn't already prepared. When she finally noticed me, her gaze met mine, and for a split second, I saw something flicker in her expression. A question. A calculation. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Darling," she said, her voice smooth, warm, as if she were truly happy to see me. "Where have you been?" I smiled. "Enjoying the party." "And you?" "Wonderful as always," she replied, her fingers lightly grazing the stem of her champagne flute. "The bride looks stunning, doesn't she?" I followed her gaze toward the newlyweds. The bride, glowing in layers of lace and silk, was laughing at something her husband had whispered in her ear. They looked untouched by reality. For a brief moment, I wondered if we had ever looked like that. If, on the surface, we still did. "Stunning," I agreed. Then I turned my full attention back to my wife. "You've been keeping busy." She tilted her head slightly, just enough to suggest curiosity, amusement. "It's a wedding, darling. That's what people do. Mingle. Socialize." I took another sip of my drink, let the silence stretch between us just long enough. She held my gaze, unblinking, waiting. Then, finally, I said it. "I saw the video." For the first time that night, I saw the faintest sign of hesitation. It was nearly imperceptible, just a slight pause in her breath, a barely there tension in her shoulders. Then she exhaled softly, setting her glass down on the table beside her. "I see." No denial. No attempt to act confused or insulted. Just those two simple words. She was already thinking, already calculating the best way to navigate this. That's all you have to say? I asked. What do you want me to say? She replied. Her voice still even, still controlled. Do you want a scene? Here? At someone else's wedding? Her gaze flickered briefly toward the guests around us, all still engaged in their own conversations, oblivious to the quiet storm building just beneath the surface. She wasn't afraid. Not of what she had done. Not of me. That was the moment I knew for certain. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a lapse in judgment or some fleeting moment of weakness. She had done this knowing exactly what it meant. And she had assumed, until now, that I would either never find out, or if I did, that I wouldn't do anything about it. I let out a quiet breath, controlled. How long? She didn't pretend to misunderstand. Does it matter? It matters. A small pause. Then, with a faint, almost indifferent shrug, she said, a while. I felt something settle inside me. Something cold and final. I glanced at the people around us, still blissfully unaware of the truth hanging between us. She was right about one thing. This wasn't the place for a scene. But that didn't mean there wouldn't be consequences. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened the message from Daniel Moreau. I turned the screen toward her. He sent it to me. This time, her reaction was noticeable. Her gaze flicked to the phone, her jaw tightening for just a fraction of a second. Then, just as quickly, she smoothed it away. I see, she said again. I wondered if she was mentally running through her options, deciding whether she needed to deal with Daniel next. If she had any idea why he had sent it to me in the first place. I lowered the phone. You made a mistake. She let out a soft, almost amused breath. And what are you going to do about it? She didn't believe I had it in me. Not to leave. Not to retaliate. Not to destroy the image she had so carefully built for herself in this world. I met her gaze steadily, then smiled. A slow, deliberate expression that held no warmth. You'll find out soon enough. Then I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in the middle of the glittering ballroom, surrounded by people who still believed she was perfect. But not for long. I didn't leave the ballroom. That would have been too easy, for her, at least. She expected me to walk away, to let the weight of what I had seen settle quietly between us, to either swallow it whole or address it later in private, where the damage could be contained. That was how people like her operated. Everything controlled. Everything calculated. But I wasn't interested in containment. I took my time moving through the crowd, stopping to exchange brief words with familiar faces. To anyone watching, I looked like a man still enjoying the event, still part of the celebration. The mask was easy to wear. I had worn it for years, even before tonight. But beneath it, my mind was working. I was deciding how, exactly, this night was going to end for her. She had done everything so smoothly, so carefully, believing she was untouchable, that her secrets were safe, that no matter what happened, the world would continue to see her as the woman she had built herself to be, polished, admired, respected. She was wrong. A waiter passed by, and I took another drink from the tray. I turned my head slightly, watching as she moved through the room. She was good. I'd give her that. The slight tension I had seen earlier was gone, buried under a carefully reconstructed expression of poise and confidence. She wasn't reckless. She wouldn't panic. But she was still watching me. Even as she smiled, even as she engaged in conversations with others, I could see the way her attention flickered in my direction. She was waiting to see what I would do. The answer was simple. I was going to take away the one thing she valued most, her image. The man from the video was here. I had already seen him once tonight, lingering near the bar, speaking with a group of people I only vaguely recognized. I made my way toward him now, weaving between clusters of guests, keeping my pace unhurried. When I reached the bar, I leaned against it, setting my glass down on the counter with just enough force to make a quiet sound. He turned his head at the noise. Our eyes met. He didn't know yet. I could tell. He had no idea I had seen the footage. He didn't look nervous, didn't try to avoid my gaze. He thought tonight was just another night. That was about to change. I gestured slightly to the empty seat beside me. Join me for a drink. There was a brief hesitation, a flicker of something in his expression, curiosity, maybe, or mild confusion. But then he nodded and took the seat. The bartender approached, and he ordered something smooth, expensive. A man comfortable in this environment, in this social class. I let the silence stretch between us for a few seconds before speaking. You've been enjoying the wedding. He gave a small, polite nod. Of course. Beautiful event. I studied him for a moment. His suit was tailored, his cufflinks subtle but undoubtedly expensive. He had the air of someone who had never doubted his place in a room like this. He had the same confidence my wife carried, the same practiced ease. I wasn't interested in small talk. I saw the video, I said. His posture shifted just slightly, so small that most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. His hand, resting near his drink, tensed for half a second before he forced himself to stay still. He didn't try to deny it. He was smarter than that. I see, he said, echoing my wife's words from earlier. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The noise of the ballroom continued around us, the sound of music and laughter and clinking glasses. But here, between us, there was only quiet tension. I tilted my head slightly. How long? He let out a slow breath, lifting his glass, taking a deliberate sip before setting it down. Would it make a difference? Another echo of her words. It wasn't surprising. They had both spent too much time in this world, learning the same rules, using the same tactics. There was no guilt in his voice, no regret. He wasn't ashamed. That was fine. He didn't need to be. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and placed it face up on the counter between us. The video was still open on the screen, paused at a frame where her hand was gripping his collar, their faces close. I tapped the play button. He exhaled through his nose, watching as the footage played out in front of him. He didn't look away, didn't shift in his seat. When it ended, I locked the screen and placed the phone back in my pocket. Then I smiled. Do you know how many people in this room would be interested in seeing that? I asked. His fingers curled slightly around his glass. You think this will hurt me? He said, his voice low. You think anyone here will care? I leaned forward slightly. I think they'll care about her. This time, his reaction was more visible. A faint narrowing of his eyes, a slight tension in his jaw. He knew I was right. His reputation would survive this. Hers wouldn't. Not because of morality. There was little of that in this world. But because she had built herself too carefully, too precisely. She had made sure she was seen as the perfect wife, the perfect woman, the one no one could touch. But I could. He let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders back. What do you want? I picked up my drink again, took a slow sip, let the moment stretch. I don't want anything from you, I said finally. I just thought you should know that she made a mistake. Then I stood up and walked away, leaving him at the bar with the weight of what I had just set in motion. I moved back through the room, aware that people were starting to notice something was off. There were glances in my direction, brief, questioning. My wife, too, had seen me speaking to him. She wasn't smiling anymore. Good. She started moving toward me, but I didn't wait for her to reach me. Instead, I stepped onto the small platform near the dance floor where the wedding party had been giving speeches earlier. The microphone was still there. I picked it up. The sound system adjusted instantly, cutting through the music. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. I kept my expression calm, my voice steady. First, I'd like to congratulate the newlyweds, I said. A beautiful couple. A beautiful night. A few guests clapped lightly, unsure. My wife had stopped walking. She was standing near the center of the room now, watching me carefully. I won't take much of your time, I continued. But since we're here to celebrate love and commitment, I thought it would be the perfect moment to share something with all of you. The room was silent now. I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward the large projection screen behind me. The video played. My wife's face was clear. The man's, too. The setting, unmistakable. The evidence, undeniable. For the first few seconds, there was only stunned silence. Then, soft gasps. Murmurs. A ripple of movement as people shifted, turning to look at her, at him. She didn't move. She didn't speak. There was nothing she could say. I lowered the microphone. Then I left the stage, handed my drink to a passing waiter, and walked toward the exit without looking back. I stepped out of the ballroom, away from the crowd, away from the slow-building chaos I had left behind. The heavy doors shut behind me with a quiet finality, muffling the growing whispers, the sharp gasps, the sudden movement of people reacting to what they had just seen. But I didn't need to hear them. I already knew what was happening. My wife, no, not my wife. Not anymore. She would be standing there, frozen for a moment, calculating her next move, her perfect world crumbling in front of her. The guests, the ones she had spent years charming, impressing, manipulating into believing she was untouchable, would be exchanging glances, low murmurs passing between them like a slow-spreading fire. And the man, the one she had chosen over me, he would be sitting there at the bar, gripping his drink a little too tightly, realizing that whatever power he thought he had in this situation was gone. I walked down the empty hallway, past gilded mirrors and polished floors, past the waitstaff who had paused their quiet duties just long enough to exchange looks before pretending they hadn't seen what had just unfolded inside. I exhaled slowly. It was done. The moment I had pressed play, the moment the video had appeared on that massive screen for everyone to see, there was no turning back. This wasn't something she could fix with carefully chosen words or a manufactured display of remorse. This wasn't a scandal she could sweep under the rug. She was exposed. A part of me expected to feel relief, satisfaction. I had delivered justice in the most public way possible, had ensured that she suffered the same humiliation she had inflicted on me. I had destroyed the image she had built, the one she had placed above everything, including me. But as I reached the end of the hallway and stepped into the dimly lit lounge, I didn't feel any of that. I felt nothing. The adrenaline that had carried me through the past hour was fading, leaving behind an emptiness that settled in my chest like a weight. I had spent so much time imagining what I would do if I ever found out she had betrayed me. I had pictured confrontations, arguments, quiet, simmering anger. But I had never pictured this quiet, detached emptiness. A waiter approached hesitantly, unsure if he should acknowledge me. I nodded once, and he took it as permission to do his job. A drink was placed in front of me, something strong, something that burned just enough to remind me I was still here. Footsteps. I knew who it was before I turned my head. She had come alone. Her heels clicked against the floor as she walked toward me, her posture still straight, still poised, but there was something different now. A stiffness in the way she carried herself, a slight hesitation in her steps, something I had never seen before. She stopped a few feet away, exhaling slowly. You should have spoken to me first. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but there was an edge beneath it. I took a sip of my drink. Why? You know why, she said. This didn't have to happen like that. I set my glass down. And how exactly did you think it was going to happen? She didn't answer. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in years, I saw her clearly. Not the woman I had once fallen in love with. Not the woman who had stood beside me, hand in hand, exchanging vows about loyalty and forever. Just a stranger wearing her face. Say what you came to say, I told her. She exhaled slowly, shifting her weight slightly, glancing back toward the hallway as if measuring how much time she had before someone else came looking for her. Did you think this would ruin me? She asked finally. I tilted my head. It won't. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then she smiled, small, controlled, a ghost of the confidence she had worn so effortlessly before tonight. It'll make things harder, she admitted. But I'll survive. She would. I knew that. People like her always found a way to land on their feet. But you, she said, watching me carefully, I don't think you thought this through. I let out a quiet breath, leaning back against the bar. And why's that? Because now what? She asked. You got your revenge. You got your justice. You humiliated me in front of everyone. But what do you have left? I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because I didn't owe her that answer. She let the silence stretch before nodding slightly, as if confirming something to herself. Good luck, she said. Then she turned and walked away. I watched her leave, watched as she disappeared back down the hallway, back toward whatever mess she had left behind. And for the first time, I realized she was right. Now what? Part 5. She was gone, and the night was finally quiet. The lounge was empty except for a few scattered glasses left behind by guests who had retreated elsewhere, away from the aftermath of what I had set in motion. The weight of everything pressed down on me, heavier now that it was over. There was nothing left to do, nothing left to say. The glass in my hand felt warm, the liquor untouched since she had left. It wasn't that I had lost my taste for it, but something about the stillness made drinking seem pointless. The anger that had fueled me had burned out, and all that remained was the quiet, suffocating reality of what came next. Leaving the lounge, I retraced my steps down the hallway, back toward the ballroom. I didn't intend to go inside, but I wanted to see what was left. From the open doors, I could see that the celebration had dimmed, the energy drained from the room. Conversations were subdued, groups of people huddled together in quiet discussions, some looking in the direction of where she had once stood, where I had once stood. The video had done exactly what I had expected. The whispers had begun, the alliances had shifted, and the social order of the evening had been rewritten in real time. Some people caught sight of me as I stood near the entrance. their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. A few gave me nods of acknowledgement, others avoided my gaze entirely. They didn't know whether to offer condolences or congratulations. Maybe they didn't know which was more appropriate. I had no reason to stay. There was no satisfaction in seeing the aftermath, no sense of victory in knowing that she was somewhere in this building dealing with the consequences. The moment had passed. The damage was done. Outside, the night air was sharp, cool against my skin after the suffocating warmth of the ballroom. The driveway was lined with luxury cars, waiting for guests who were beginning to filter out in small groups. Valets moved efficiently, opening doors, offering polite nods as people disappeared into the night. I walked past them without acknowledging any of it, the weight of my own thoughts making everything else feel distant. The reality was setting in. This wasn't just a scene at a wedding. It wasn't just an argument or a betrayal that could be swept aside with time. It was the end of something that had once defined my life. The moment the video played, I had severed whatever remained between us. There was no salvaging it, no pretending. The city stretched out ahead of me, lights flickering against the dark sky. I had nowhere to be, no destination in mind. For the first time in years, I was completely untethered. One by one, the luxury cars pulled away from the entrance, each carrying someone who still belonged to the world I had just shattered. The weight of everything pressed down on me, heavier now that it was over. And then, amidst the quiet movement of the departing guests, I noticed someone watching me. A woman, standing just outside the reach of the valet lights, her gaze steady. She hadn't been in the ballroom, hadn't been part of the whispers and shifting conversations inside. She wasn't part of that world at all. For the first time that night, something shifted. A new beginning, perhaps, or just another step forward. But at least it was something. The street was quieter now, the crowd thinning as more guests disappeared into the night. The weight in my chest hadn't lessened, but it had changed. It was no longer the sharp, cutting tension that had followed me through the evening, nor the cold emptiness that had settled in after I exposed her. Now, it was something else, something undefined, something I wasn't sure I even recognized yet. I stood at the edge of the grand entrance, watching the last few remnants of the night unravel. The staff moved swiftly, clearing away the evidence of a once perfect evening. A few guests lingered near the steps, their conversations hushed, their eyes flickering toward me when they thought I wouldn't notice. The whispers would last for weeks, maybe months. People would dissect every moment, every expression, every reaction. Some would take her side. Others would justify what I had done. But in the end, it wouldn't matter. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no undoing it. I turned away from the ballroom, from the people who still belonged to that world, and started walking. The pavement was slick from the humidity, reflecting the glow of streetlights in long, distorted streaks. My car was somewhere nearby, waiting with a valet who had likely been instructed to remain silent, to offer no opinions, just keys and a nod. But I wasn't ready to leave just yet. The sound of heels against stone reached me before I saw her. A woman, standing a few feet away, watching me with a quiet sort of patience. She hadn't been inside, hadn't been part of the carefully curated chaos of the wedding. There was no recognition in her gaze, no hesitation, no judgment. Just curiosity, perhaps, or something close to understanding. For a moment, I considered walking past her, continuing on into the night without another thought. But something about the way she stood there, unaffected, separate from everything that had just happened, made me pause. She didn't belong to the world I had just torn apart, and maybe that was exactly what I needed. The night stretched ahead, uncertain and open. Whatever happened next, whatever came after this, I wasn't sure yet. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back.